Hello, my name's Ted, and I'm an editor here at The Signal at the AAR and a host of our new show, Coffee Break. Delighted to be joined today by Patrick Fuchs, chairman of the Surface Transportation Board.
Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me, Ted.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Have a few questions that we'll jump in just to start on a lighter note. So first, what are you drinking in your coffee cup?
Literally, I'm drinking water right now. Yeah.
All right. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to the STB.
No, appreciate it. So I started off in government at the Office of Management and Budget. I was in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is the part of OMB that oversees the regulatory process. So we assess significant and economically significant regulations and determine, whether or not they could be made more cost beneficial, either more beneficial or less costly, hopefully both. And so I started off there. That was a really good purview of federal regulations. And one of the aspects of my portfolio was railroads. And so the regulations that were coming from the Federal Railroad Administration predominantly. From there, I moved to the Senate Commerce Committee and the Surface Transportation Group over there under the leadership of Chairman John Thune at the time. And got to work on various railroad legislation, and it was a really enriching experience. And then I was lucky enough to be nominated to the Surface Transportation Board.
And remind us, how long have you been there?
At the board?
Yeah.
About 7 years now, if you can believe it. Yeah, time flies.
Talk about that time. I mean, how have things changed from 7 years ago to today?
It's a great question. Well, if you take a look at the board generally, if you go back to ICTA in 1995, that's created the board. But the board's predecessor, Interstate Commerce Commission, was really the original federal regulatory
Mhm.
agency. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, and so one of the things that you experience coming onto the board and living it every day is sort of the legacy and weight of that 100-year plus precedent, but also an industry that has been very dynamic and has evolved over time through periods where we saw the massive growth of railroads, and then we saw the decline, and then the rebirth through deregulation, and then the sort of modernization of the agency with ICTA. And so when I came onto the board in 2019, you sort of had it was after the STB reauthorization, which made some really
Mhm.
positive procedural reforms, calls for some additional helpful authorities for the agency. But fundamentally, you had sort of an industry structure and a broader legislative landscape that had been in effect for a couple decades now. And so what we were doing at that time in 2019 is to really kind of survey the lay of the land. What has worked well? What has not worked well? What are some authorities that the board is maybe not making its best use of? What are some areas where we're still too burdensome? And so, when I joined, it was with Chairman Begeman, and she had a lot of energetic and fresh thinking. And so it really was kind of a period where we could assess, all right, how have we been doing business the last 20 years, and how can we make, our regulatory framework better?
When you think about the different people you've worked with, you
Yeah.
mentioned Ann Begeman, who was
Yeah.
chair when you started. Then you had Martin Oberman,
Yes.
who succeeded him, and obviously now you're in this role as chair.
Yes.
Um, Miss Begeman and Mr. Oberman obviously span different political
Yeah.
parties. We're in a very political town.
Right.
Do you feel like the STB bucks that trend in some ways in terms of partisanship?
Well, if you look at the economic regulation of railroads, it is not among the most partisan issues in the country,
Right.
and there a lot of our disputes are sort of party disputes where you're really making decisions on the evidence and argument. And then we have a lot of what the boards does is licensing work. So as a general matter, kind of our area, of course, there are different regulatory philosophies. Of course, there are different ideologies that people bring to the job,
Hmm.
but we are not the most heated part of the public debate as a general matter, which actually makes it really nice. And I think part of the reason for that, first, is that you know railroads sort of being such an economic backbone that touches so much of the country, but also there's so much in the railroad industry sort of can be measured, right? You have your rate, you have your service, you can measure service, you can measure outcomes, you can measure volumes, and so it is a very objective landscape,
Hmm.
and for that, you get a good bit of feedback for how things are actually performing. What are the outcomes of a particular licensing decision? What are the outcomes of a particular complaint case? And when you're kind of grounded in those facts, it sort of lightens or lowers the temperature
Yeah.
because you're really, you're talking about those objective matters. Now on Marty and Ann and specifically, you know, uh, both of those former chairmen, and something that I'd like to continue to this day, have really maintained collegiality at the board. I think we realize, as a group, that all of us bring something to the table. All of us have a perspective or an expertise, knowledge base by which we can learn from each other and make each other better. And so that was sort of, how they engage, even though, again, different knowledge bases, different skill sets, different ideologies, but we all tried to learn from one another, and that was also a very positive working relationship, and that's part of the board's culture these days. Um, and so that's great. And for them personally, Anne was such a hard worker. She was so passionate, and she spent 2 decades on the Hill, right? She had so much knowledge of the transportation regulatory landscape. And Marty being a trial lawyer, he loved to debate, he loved to engage, and so you could talk to him for hours and debate with him for hours about different things. And so those are both qualities that are kind of really exciting to work with, in the sense that, if you're debating someone, you elevate your game, and when you see someone so hardworking, you want to work just as hard. So they're great people to work with, and they really helped foster a culture that we're hopefully maintaining to this day.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I know you studied economics in
Yeah.
college.
Yeah.
I always consider you a kind of like a constant learner, for at least
Yeah.
what I've known about you over the years. What has influenced your philosophy, or how you try and approach your job, particularly from like a regulatory philosophy or ideology standpoint?
It's a great question. If I circle back to the experiences that I had professionally, um, within that OMB, the OIRA, the culture there was really heavily on cost benefit analysis, sort of a utilitarian perspective. And then you go to the Hill with people, with constituents and people visiting. It's much more engaging with the public, and so you get a greater appreciation for the practical side of things. Not everything is what's outlined in a model or a spreadsheet. That isn't important. It is a tool, and it forces you and disciplines your thinking.
Hmm.
But there are a lot of other things that brought to bear in terms of the practical implementation. And then there are other value systems besides sort of a utilitarian framework to be brought to bear in terms of what governs your decisions in public life. And so, but really, in the Hill was really a lesson in the practicalities of, because you engage with stakeholders so often. And then you go to the board, and so you have this kind of grounding in sort of theoretical cost benefit framework. You have a grounding in sort of the practical everyday life. But then it's like, well, now you're in the people that have to put it into motion, your decisions, right? So it's you have the governing legislative framework, but then you have to adjudicate under that framework. You have to set regulations under that framework. And so then you start to think about administrative processes and things like, how the administrative state should be, and the energetic executive, and these types of things. And so those are all kind of, fundamentally groundings. But like, I would tell you, like, we are all sort of, uh, yeah, there's more to life than just in our professional experiences. And so when I think about kind of what is motivating, or what kind of governs me, is like, I actually think back to family, and like my dad, and like, growing up in Wisconsin and having someone who kind of had multiple jobs and worked their way to create something of their own. And it was really like a fundamental work ethic that you kind of bring to the job. And so that actually suits sort of the board's workload really well, in the sense that we have 150 cases at one time, we have 400 decisions, and we have detailed dockets. I mean, there was definitely aspects of big picture thinking and strategy. There's just also times, just cases where you have to put in the work. And so, a big part of what shapes me is just that overall sort of kind of uh, love and belief in the grind, and just grinding through cases, and trying to get to a good outcome, applying the value sets. But before you can apply the value sets, you have to understand the material. And you're not going to do a good job applying your values if you don't know the facts. And so the kind of the biggest thing that I try to bring is just to work extraordinarily hard every day to understand the material, so that when I apply my values, it's on a more grounded basis.
Let's talk a little bit about that. So, with the caveat that we're recording this in about
Yeah.
mid-April,
Yeah.
um, what types of high-level issues are you focused on at the board? And I'll caveat it further that we'll put certain transactions to the side.
Yeah. So, you know, in a broad thing, the values that I'm trying to bring in and inculcate to the board are accountability, transparency, and collaboration. And then that kind of From those values, you get to, what are the issues that you can advance? What are the things that are consistent with those values where you can see um, a lot of benefit for the public? So the top of mind issues are things like permitting reform,
Mhm.
preemption, competition, data modernization, and processing cases faster, and in a strong way. So it's taken it from the first, or taken from the bottom.
Mhm.
Um, like I mentioned, like, 400 decisions a year. A lot of those disputes are people who are trying to understand about trackage rights or a new transaction or new construction. People are trying to plan their businesses. Um, you make operational capital decisions. And so if we can provide sort of additional certainty, and that includes not just telling people the date, but the date being within the speed of business, so to speak, or at least consistent with business decision making. That's a real public benefit in and of itself, and that means that we have to process our cases efficiently. So that has been a very big focus. It was probably a big focus of mine, particularly for the first year, because anything you do from a regulatory standpoint, if you can't make decisions to implement, the regulation will fail. So we started there. Um, and then, some of the other issues I've talked about. If you look at, permitting reform, well, first of all, that feeds into the speed of decision making. It also feeds into the cost to the public. And then, on the value of sort of collaboration, these are areas where, sometimes we have railroad and shipper disputes. Sometimes we have railroad to railroad disputes. These are areas where railroad and shippers generally agree. This is a new 10-mile spur to an industrial park or a biofuels facility, things that are just key to economic growth. And and are we doing everything we can to help the market meet that need to ensure that railroads can build and meet the needs of their shippers? And so when I call it sort of permitting reform, sometimes it's called environmental streamlining, and I sort of have moved away from that term because what we're really talking about here is not changing the fundamental environmental regulation in terms of what the conditions are imposed. It's about the process of how you get there. There are some things that are never going to need conditions, so why are we going through the review? You
Mhm.
can't do anything about it. You don't have power to do anything about it. Or there are some things where if you do early engagement, you know what it's going to be, so you don't have to go through a draft. And then you can cut steps out of the process, and all of a sudden you're cutting 6 months, a year, $500,000 out. Meaningful differences
It's
for
real money.
small projects, for spurs and other things. Some of these facilities, some of it's one or two facilities that it's a 4-mile spur. So you start adding on $1 million, that changes the business calculus. And oh, and by the way, it's a year where people aren't employed. And so those are things that make, if you do that across the American economy, of which rail touches all of it, you're starting to make a meaningful difference. So that's permitting reform. Preemption is very same thing. It's sort of, you know, sometimes preemption involves, by its very nature, like superseding a law. So you're like, well, how does that go to collaboration? Well, because before decisions are made, it's litigation. It goes to a local court. It can go to a federal court. It can come to the board. There's concurrent jurisdiction with preemption, and but what happens in that litigation is these people find 5 cases over here. These people find 5 cases over here. It goes a year and a half, but nobody's sitting down. And if people don't know what the law is, you can't sit down with the city manager or the state representative or whomever and talk about, all right, well, what's the solution here? What is the concerns? How can I accommodate these concerns while also, you know, um, exercising my statutory and constitutional rights, is an inherent interstate mode. Um, and and so if we can do more to to have clarity about what the preemption framework is nationally, then it can maybe short circuit a lot of that litigation and kind of cut right to the discussion portion of it. And while, of course, I think, there's also a public benefit in terms of allowing things to move across state lines at lower costs, such that it's in the national interest, right? That where there might be a local interest that might not be aligned with a broader set, right? If you've got some shippers in Wyoming and the traffic traverses through a state along the route, that particular locality might not be caring about the people. The elected officials might not be elected by the people of Wyoming. They might not care as much about the people of Wyoming, but certainly from a national perspective, we care about everybody.
Mm.
So there's sort of that's I think a good thing to work on. Data modernization. This is on, transparency, making, hopefully we'll get a dashboard up here pretty soon that makes the service metrics clearer. We're adding it. We're proposing to add a couple service metrics, provide shippers and other decision makers more information, help plan their businesses, really trying to supercharge transparency on the data modernization. That extends to cases, providing more information about our cases, case progress. Um, Competition, I think, goes to accountability and making sure that there are those market-based forces that can drive accountability in the marketplace. And so I sort of, as you kind of craft a regulatory agenda, I do it with those values in mind, and then we got to execute on it. But I have to say this, like, I'm sort of very conscious about you know what we can deliver while also doing a good job on the things we are statutorily required to do. So there are some things where we want to change the regulatory framework, but they're fundamentally discretionary changes. Now we think they're good discretionary changes. So you should do that.
Mhm.
But you still have to process the construction case on time. You still have to work out the rate case on time. You still have to do a good and thorough and fair job on a transaction. And so as you're crafting sort of a discretionary agenda, you have to do it with the utmost sort of understanding of the statutory requirements and what you have to fulfill for the things you must decide.
Can you talk about an example or two that you've seen in your time in which greater clarity in that regard would be helpful for other things you talked about, such as industrial development?
Yeah. Yes, I can. So there are, I think, three things in specifically.
Mm.
Um, some of it is just there are kind of um, when you think about intermodal facilities and base customer facilities and that, and the sort of the inflows to that, say, for example, road regulation and the like directly related to rail. I think some of that surrounding that where it might not necessarily be just a carrier, right? And how that relates to, carrier discrimination or the like
Mhm.
is probably an area. Second is the extent to which preemption attaches to facilities that are not owned by carriers. I think probably has some gray area where it is part and parcel of rail regulation, but it is not owned by a rail carrier. I think there's some area where the board has to give some thought as to that. And then the third is there is a kind of a world of state specific laws that are implemented under the auspice of a federal law. And of course, our preemption statute is written for state or federal law
Mm.
in terms of exclusive authority. And we try to, the case law is such where you try to harmonize with federal law, but then there are things that where things are directly opposed to the purpose of ICTA, which is a smooth flow of interstate commerce and preventing a patchwork. And so I think that sort of a muscular approach on that can be very, very clarifying. And so I think like an example, and it's not pending before the board, so I think I have a little bit more freedom in that is if you look at the California Air Resources Board actions that were taken about locomotive. I mean,
Sure.
whether or not they were under the auspices of a federal law, that was a state-driven action that created a patchwork and a very expensive patchwork at that. Billions of dollars, some short lines going out of business, driving things to the highway counterintuitively probably would have some and so when you look at something like that and you think about the interplay with the Clean Air Act, that is an area in terms of how ICTA relates to other federal law under the sort of auspices or claimed auspices of a state law or auspices of a federal law at a state action. That's an area where I think the board could provide additional clarity.
Yeah, I remember that issue well, uh, and it was good to see it come to a good conclusion, at least for now. I mean, who knows
Yeah.
what the future looks like, right?
Yes. Right.
Um,
But that's exactly it, though, Ted. Which is um, that the whole idea behind this, behind say if we were the board were to do a policy statement, would be that's something that people in the future could look to, and because of that concurrent jurisdiction, because preemption cases can be brought before state courts or federal courts or the board, a future board, but also, if you're a state judge that is parachuting into a complex railroad case, having a 40-page document that summarizes all of the law in the area and presents it clearly and coherently is actually a benefit, right? And the idea is it doesn't even get there, right? The litigation doesn't get there because the decision makers at the local level see this. But if it does get there, even the case hopefully will go better in the future.
yeah, I was
I
really
appreciate
grateful
it.
for you to come and join us today and to hear about the work that you're doing, and we certainly appreciate your diligence and your
Yeah,
thoroughness and all that you do.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Ted.
Yeah,
All
thank
right,
you.
take care.